Let me say hello to everyone present. Thank you all for coming to Boston, Massachusetts on this cloudy day. This is the second in-person meeting of the FCC's Open Internet Advisory Committee. And the first thing to tell and remind everybody is that the mics are hot. We are broadcasting, webcasting live to how many people I know not, but that will be true even during breaks and such. So anything uttered in this room you should prepare to have uttered to the world, which offers great opportunities for spamming, but we'll deal with that if that should come up. So our committee is reconvened for another session. Most of the work of the committee is accomplished through its working groups, and we've devoted the lion's share of our time in this public meeting to hearing from and interacting with the working groups that are comprised from members of the committee. And so we'll be hearing from the four respective chairs and one substitute for those working groups. And as we do that, the mobile broadband group will have a disproportionate share of the time, in large part because they've simply had more going on. So we'll hear more from them, have more opportunity for members of the committee not on the working groups to ask questions and respond. We'll hear then from the other three groups and then have a chance to take stock, look to see whether the working group structure is working and whether to think about adding new ones, and then we'll end with a public comment period around 11:30 until noon, and then the public portion of the meeting will adjourn so that the working groups can then meet in person and carry on their work. So all that said, are there any logistical, procedural, or other questions before we dive right in? Seeing none, I think it'd probably be helpful to start with a quick round of reintroductions from the members of the committee seated at the table and one on the phone. So maybe we should just start. Brad, do you want to lead off and just say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I'm Brad Burnham, and I am one of the founding partners of Union Square Ventures in New York. We're a venture capital firm that invests in the applications layer of the web. So we are the first institutional investors in Twitter and Tumblr and Foursquare and Etsy, Indeed, things like that. So we're investing in the companies that take advantage of the investment that the infrastructure providers and the carriers are making that make the internet possible.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Shane Greenstein. I'm a professor at Northwestern University. I teach in the Kellogg School of Management. For many years, I've been doing academic studies of the internet, and particularly the internet service provider industry, all the way back to when it was dial-up, and also as a broadband provider. And that's about it.
Shane is too modest to say so, but the day before yesterday, he successfully ran the Chicago Marathon.
Oh wow.
Congratulations. You sore? He actually limped on the way in. Alyssa.
I'm Alyssa Cooper. I'm the Chief Computer Scientist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit public policy organization focused at the intersection of civil liberties and the internet.
I'm Charles Slocum. I'm the Assistant Executive Director at the Writers Guild of America out in Hollywood, and my members are eager to use the internet to get their stories out to the public.
I'm Jennifer Rexford. I'm a professor at Princeton University in the Computer Science Department, and I'm also part of the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton.
Hi, I'm Daniel Kirshner. I'm Associate General Counsel and Senior Advisor for Internet Policy at the Federal Communications Commission, and I am the designated federal officer for the Open Internet Advisory Committee.
I'm Jonathan Zittrain. I teach law and computer science at Harvard University, and I'm a co-founder of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society.
I'm all choked up. I'm David Clark. I'm at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab up at MIT. I've been concerned with the design of the internet for a long time, and I'm the co-chair of this committee, and looking forward to having more fun. Do you need this one?
Yeah, this is fine. I'm Dennis Roberson. I'm at Illinois Institute of Technology. I'm professor of computer science there, and since you're doing all these co-founding, I'm a co-founder of the Wireless Network and Communications Research Center at IIT, and I'm representing T-Mobile in this forum.
I'm Kevin McIlerney, and for the past 8 years I've been at Comcast, and my role there is responsible for network engineering.
Hi, I'm Michelle Zatlin. I'm the co-founder of a company called Cloudflare. We are a web infrastructure company that takes advantage of the wonderful internet, and we make sure that anyone with a website or web app can make sure that it's fast, safe, and available for users, or in other words, making sure that anybody with something to say or a business or an idea has the same resources as the internet giants.
Hi, I'm Marcus Weldon. I'm the chief technologist for Alcatel-Lucent. I co-founded nothing.
There's time yet.
Exactly, there's time, maybe.
We can arrange
but no, so I control sort of the technology direction of Alcatel-Lucent, and that's the company that here in North America makes the preponderance of mobile networks and also wireline networks, with the exception of HFC networks where we don't have much of a play, but we're behind Fios and AT&T's UVerse and LTE networks and things like that, so we know quite a bit about infrastructure.
I'm Leslie Daigle. I'm the Chief Internet Technology Officer for the Internet Society, which is a 20-year-old not-for-profit organization with membership around the globe. We've been engaged in technology, policy, and development work for the last 20 years, and our only agenda is to make sure that the Internet remains for everyone.
I'm Chuck Kalmanek. I'm head of research at AT&T Labs, an engineer by trade and training. We work in networking, cloud infrastructure technologies. Really, the research organization is focused on both doing research and contributing to the scientific community, as well as understanding how technology influences the businesses that AT&T is in.
And end of the table here, I'm Neil Hunt. I'm the Chief Product Officer for Netflix. And I would say that mostly I oversee the consumer experience, the business model of delivery of video across the internet. I also oversee the technology development, a lot of the cloud work, and of course the Open Connect work that we've done in terms of building out infrastructure for delivery of video bits to consumers. Obviously, we're very interested in the continuing smooth functioning of the internet at very high capacity levels.
Thank you, Neil. And end of the table, but not end of the list, Jessica Gonzalez. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I run the policy shop there. We give voice to the Latino community on media and telecom issues. And I'm sorry that I missed the last meeting. I was out on maternity leave, but I'm glad to be here by phone today.
Wonderful. Welcome, and we will trust that if there's a moment where you are moved to give voice, you will do so, and we will simply hear you from the ceiling emanating with your views. Yes. Very good. So why don't we now turn to our working group check-ins, and our first is the Mobile Broadband Working Group, chaired by Jennifer Rexford. And Jennifer, you may even have a deck to share, is that right? That's right. And also it'd be great to just, maybe through self-identification, who's a member of that group. Who do we have here from that group? Terrific. All right. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So I think the slide should be popping up there shortly. Great, thank you. So I'm still Jennifer Rexford from Princeton. I just want to take a few minutes to tell you what our working group has been doing. Our working group is made up of a number of people that just raised their hands a moment ago, a nice mix of people from a lot of different backgrounds. And we've been having a lot of really great discussions about the Open Internet Order and its implications for mobile broadband. So what we've been doing the first 6 weeks or so of our group is trying to get an understanding of what mobile broadband is all about, and also how the open internet principles are working in the mobile broadband space. And so a couple of key things to note. Mobile broadband is very distinctive. It's an increasingly crucial part of the internet ecosystem, and yet it's still technically at a fairly early stage of development and deployment. And so when the Open Internet Order was written, a number of exceptions were put in place that treated mobile broadband differently than fixed point. Both require network transparency about what practices are being applied, but some of the no blocking requirements are a little bit more weak for mobile broadband. Mobile broadband cannot block lawful websites and cannot block things that are competing directly with a carrier's own voice and video telephony services, but otherwise has somewhat less strict requirements around blocking and around differentiated service. And so one of the things our group was looking at was trying to understand how well that's working and whether those are the right guidelines going forward. And so what we wanted to do at the beginning is it's very easy for these topics to become very abstract. And so what we decided to do was to take 3 case studies and go into them in a bit more detail so that we'd have something concrete to discuss and to guide our discussions going forward. And so what we wanted to do in that first step was to just try to capture the relevant facts and issues and viewpoints and try to stop short of making any kind of policy recommendation, because it's sort of dangerous, as our group talked quite a bit about, to draw policy implications from any one specific case study. And so we're really looking at these case studies just to get the discussion rolling and to identify issues that our group needs to explore going forward, and also identify places where our group needs assistance to be able to dive into more detail. So these are the 3 case studies we looked at. AT&T's limiting of the FaceTime application, mobile apps having overloading the signaling resources of carrier networks, and a third one that we won't talk about today on some carriers blocking the use of the Google Wallet application. So just look ahead. I'm going to now go through the AT&T FaceTime example. I'm going to first start by just giving a view of the facts on the ground, and then some of the responses on both sides of the debate about whether the actions AT&T took were warranted or not, and then kind of sketch out what our group discussed in terms of the issues that would help in making a decision about whether this was a violation of the Open Internet Order or not. So just a brief review for folks that don't know, FaceTime is an Apple application that offers high-quality video chat to iPhone, iPad, and iMac users. And it's originally was available only over Wi-Fi. And what happened is if you made a phone call, you could click on a button directly as part of the calling process to be able to upgrade that call to using video. So it's a little bit unusual in that it's integrated directly into the normal calling functions of the phone and built into the phone as opposed to something the user has to download as a separate app. So in June 2012, just a few months ago, Apple announced that it would start making FaceTime available over cellular networks in iOS 6, which, as you know, just came out pretty recently. And they noted at the time that carrier restrictions might apply for its use over 3G. In August 2012, AT&T announced it would be limiting the use of FaceTime over cellular to users of a particular pricing plan called the Mobile Share Plan. And that plan has a data cap that's shared amongst a collection of user devices. Just as a quick note, a couple of the other large providers, Sprint and Verizon, would confirm that FaceTime would work on all of their plans, although it's worth noting that Verizon requires users that upgrade to iOS 6 to adopt their mobile share plan. So essentially makes what the distinction between Verizon and AT&T a little subtle, de facto the same, but in practice a little different, one associated with the app, the other associated with the version of the operating system, but in both cases requiring a particular pricing plan to be used to be able to use the app. So what was the response? Well, some advocates and members of the press really denounced the decision that AT&T made, and the arguments went something like this, that AT&T is violating the Open Internet Order because it's blocking an application that competes with AT&T's own voice and video telephony service, and any exemption for sort of reasonable management practice shouldn't apply to favoring users from one data plan over the users of another data plan. Some of these articles also noted some not quite substantiated suspicions that Apple may have had a hand in deciding that this was the appropriate way to stage the introduction of FaceTime over cellular. That may very well be true, but it's not something that the press was able to really explicitly verify. So AT&T in turn responded with some arguments saying that, okay, the Open Internet Order requires transparency. This was transparent. AT&T was very clear that FaceTime would not be usable except on the mobile share plan. AT&T noted it doesn't have a competitive video chat application, so this issue about not being allowed to block applications that compete with the carrier's own voice and video telephony services didn't apply, and also noted that the Open Internet Order is silent on preloaded built-in applications, differentiated from ones that the user has to explicitly buy or download, for example, through the App Store. And also noted that users could continue running the FaceTime application over Wi-Fi from their phones as before. So those are sort of the two sides of the argument presented by people on both sides of the debate. What our group ended up discussing was sort of four different questions that might help decide whether this is normal management practice or something to be concerned about. And I think the vote's still out on the answer to that question, but just to sketch out those issues, the first and perhaps most important one is whether a preloaded application is different than one a user has to download. To be clear, this application is tightly integrated with the operating system. It is in a very popular phone So it would become instantaneously available to a very, very large number of users. And it would be accessed through the core calling functions of the phone, distinct from the apps that a user might download. The second issue is that the application makes fairly symmetric use of bandwidth. So if you look at cellular networks, they tend to be asymmetric in their capacity, with a lot more capacity from the network towards the user and much lower bit rates available from the user up to the internet. This application is symmetric in its usage, which means it can put a lot of stress on the upstream capacity of the network. In particular, some studies showed that a single FaceTime user might use as much as a third to a half of the upstream capacity of a sector of a base station. So it makes it extremely large bandwidth user. A third issue is that most multimedia applications adapt in the presence of congestion. So if there are other users that are using the network at the same time, they'll send at a lower rate. It appears from some studies done by members of our own group that FaceTime doesn't adapt as much as other applications in the same class do, meaning that if it's sharing bandwidth with those other applications, it's going to actually consume a larger fraction or a larger share of the resources than other applications of the same class. And finally, another issue we talked about was whether reasonable network management practice might include the ability to gradually stage the introduction of a new application that might otherwise become instantaneously very widely used. And that one way to sub-select a set of users might be to limit the application to a particular billing plan, as happened here. So those are the sort of four issues we talked about. Again, the first one is the most important one, as that was the argument that the AT&T's response used to say that this was not actually applicable to the open internet order in the first place. So we didn't actually come down with an opinion on these issues, but I think different members of our group have different viewpoints. But we think going forward, understanding whether these types of issues should be handled in a particular way or not is something we want to discuss going forward. So I want to just switch gears briefly to the second case study that we talked about, which was looking at how a particular issue where cellular networks are very different from wireline networks, which is the use of a signaling channel to be able to keep track of mobile devices as they move and to keep track of their current location. So essentially what happens is a device will notify the network when it wants to be able to send traffic. And if that happens too often, that device can actually overload the signaling resources of the network. So to be clear, it might mean that certain other devices are unable to even get their new requests to reach the network in the first place. And this signaling resource, if overused, can become congested before the actual bandwidth that carries the actual data traffic becomes overused. And so the desire to protect these resources is important because the efficacy of actually using the real bandwidth on the network can be compromised if the signaling channel is overloaded. So just to reiterate, this is a very distinct issue that exists in the cellular space. It doesn't exist other places because of the way radio resource control is actually done and because that channel is itself a shared and constrained resource. So there was a very interesting paper written by researchers at AT&T and the University of Michigan that we went over, and it looked at a class of applications that are quite chatty, that actually consume unusual amount of resources on the signaling channel. And the reason they do that is because they make periodic transfers of some sort on the network. This may be because the application is a push service, or it's periodically sending packets to keep a network address translator happy over time, or it's polling periodically to see if something has changed in its environment, or it's having ads updated periodically on the phone, or it's collecting periodic measurements of user behavior to be able to adapt the application. So for all these reasons, these applications might, with some periodicity, send traffic on the network and invoke the signaling resources on the network. And depending on the exact details of how much data they send and how frequently, they may actually send quite a lot of resources on the signaling channel. So this paper found that up to 30% of the resources on the signaling channel might be used by applications that contribute less than 2% of the total volume of traffic on the network. And in fact, in some cases, a single application might consume 90% of the signaling channel. As an aside, this also tends to drain the battery on the phone, and particularly if the phone periodically is sending data just after it went to sleep. So this issue is not only affecting resources on the carrier network, but also perhaps harming the user experience by draining the battery. And as sort of a cautionary note, as we start to see more and more machine-to-machine traffic, we may very well see an increase in the amount of traffic that is doing this sort of periodic polling. So one particular challenge here, and again, it's somewhat unique to the mobile space, is that you've got three different parties who might be able to contribute to addressing this problem: the end device, the application developer, and the carrier. And each of them have some unique strengths in being able to do this, but some unique limitations as well, making it actually perhaps a multifaceted problem where all three of these parties need to be involved. So the end device arguably has the strongest incentives to address this problem because it's draining the user's battery and affecting the user's performance, and does have at least some knowledge of which application is actually running or introducing this signaling load. But unfortunately has somewhat incomplete control over the behavior of those individual applications that were written by others and installed by the user. The app developer has, in some sense, the most opportunity to adjust his one application to be more cognizant of the signaling load it might introduce, but has no control, obviously, over the other applications running on the phone and very little ability to know the state of the network. And finally, the network sees all the traffic and controls the scheduling of resources, so might seem to be the best equipped to deal with this problem. But in some sense, the cat is already out of the bag once the traffic has hit the network. And so it's a little bit cart before the horse, if you will, to be able to try to block this traffic or to rate limit this traffic that's consuming signaling resources only after it's actually started to consume those resources. So there's no real clear answer to this question. Probably the right solution is a mix of the three. And so just a few notes, the ways one might go about addressing this challenge. One is to note that this really is a call for some level of application-specific management, adjusting the timers that are used in applications to reduce the likelihood they overload signaling resources, to combine these sort of periodic transfers with regular data transfers, and to provide some level of application-level signaling, for example, for push applications. A second note, though, about what makes this hard is the number of applications is just mind-boggling, and many of them have a relatively short lifetime. As the statistic here indicates, the average lifetime of a mobile app is a month, and it makes just $700. So it's very, very difficult. Now, obviously, a small number of apps contribute the vast majority of the traffic, but as we've seen, signaling load can be asymmetric. An application that doesn't generate much data traffic can still be a big consumer of signaling resources. So just as an example, AT&T has a tool that helps app developers be more cognizant of what battery usage they're introducing and what signaling load they're introducing, and has already worked with 100 app developers, just as an indication of how many developers one has to try to reach to even start to get a rough handle on this question. Optimizations here are necessarily complicated. They have to be done both within an app and across apps, and perhaps jointly between devices and the network. So again, here, this particular example is perhaps even a little less concrete than the FaceTime example, but I wanted to go over it just to give you a sense of some of the technical difficulties that impinge on the policy discussions we're having here that we have to address going forward. So finally, essentially, one of the big issues our group has talked a lot about is the sort of murky phrase, reasonable management practice. And what does it mean in the carrier space, particularly for mobile? This is challenging because the applications have a large mix and they're rapidly evolving. The number of mobile devices is also growing. And the resources, both in terms of network bandwidth and in terms of signaling resources, are quite limited. And so one particular challenge our group ran into is that the technical details matter here immensely. And we need to know what's possible today. What alternatives do people have to manage their network that might be enable greater openness, and what are the best common practices today for using the available mechanisms. And so one idea we had was perhaps to enlist some help from other groups that might be able to do a bit more of a technical deep dive than our group is able to do to help understand the relevant technical context so that we can have a better understanding of what management practices might be available in the first place to help address these and other issues that we're going to discuss. And so the BTAG is one group, for example, that might be able to help us deep dive a bit into those issues. And our group itself also wants to dig into some of these issues, and particularly the ongoing standards, to understand in the next few years how the mechanisms available for doing management of cellular data networks might evolve to be able to make some of the practices that are used today be able to be replaced by ones that are more respectful of open internet access. And that's it.
Jennifer, that was a 15-minute tour de force explaining what's going on. So thank you for that. And we should see if there are questions, amendments, augmentations from anybody on the panel. Yeah, Charles.
Are there examples in the signaling issue? Are there examples of apps that are particularly chatty, or just to put a concrete face on it for those of us who aren't as familiar?
Yeah, I think, Marcus, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think one of the examples was Pandora, actually, in the paper. And there the point was made that it asks the phone, what are you listening to? But it does it every 60 seconds. yet you listen to a song typically for 3 to 4 minutes. So it was pointed out that just by extending that timer to be 4 minutes, because that's the time interval by which something would have changed, that would have greatly improved the performance of that app. And then there were some media apps that pushed little updates and ads, as Jennifer noticed, that certainly on Android, pushing ads every 60 seconds that would display within your app, whether it be Angry Birds or whatever. Those were the types of things that were noted in the paper. But the examples are actually in that paper. We can circulate so you can see.
It's actually interesting from the point of view of the app developer. Part of the magic of being able to be an app developer is somehow the network will manage to make bits move, and maybe it'll be Wi-Fi and maybe it won't. And I hear in Jennifer's presentation the possibility that an app developer might do well to be more sensitive to thinking that there would be multiple environments in which it would be used. But that's asking a lot of an app developer that isn't used to thinking about that.
Yeah, it's very true. And just to build on Jennifer's comment, there is work going on in the standards group. As you know, well, maybe you don't, for mobile standards, it's 3GPP is the standards organization, and they've started looking at building a signaling proxy that the application would be able to ask for delivery of signaling, but under control of something that knows about those things, Jonathan. So it would know about cellular and Wi-Fi, and you make a request for the delivery, and it's done on a open basis, so that you simply make your request. I need to signal this. Do it when is best for the load on the network, and everyone gets access to that same sort of resource. So that's one approach that's being taken.
Fascinating. Yes, Shane.
Yeah, question. I didn't quite understand the remark about users having the incentive to look into this. Is this transparent to users that this is going on, and do users have any point of control over it, or is it largely outside of both outside of their view and outside of their point of control?
Yeah, I was saying actually more that the end device has an incentive. So the operating system, for example, on the device might have an incentive to coalesce requests that are coming across different applications, okay, or to do its own kind of control of how often that traffic gets out. You're right. I mean, the user, it's a fairly low-level technical thing. And that's, in fact, I think, an important point. Actually, very hard for the user to reason about this because they think mainly about the bandwidth. They can kind of reason that a little bit of text should be less bandwidth than a very large image or a video. But to reason about the underlying signaling behavior, it's asking an awful lot.
Yeah,
We don't know
just
of
comment
apps
on that
that
as well.
We don't know of apps that exist to help users audit what's going on with the phone, or even rank the other apps on the phone for battery usage. And
yeah, in fact, one thing our group talked about was, should there be a sort of wall of shame, if you will, for apps that are particularly bad about using signaling resources, and this issue about the rapid turnover in apps, that an app exists for 30 days on average, and many of these developers may not even know that the wall of shame exists, even if it's a high-profile, wall of shame, that it makes it very difficult to be able to deal with this. Whereas in the backbone space, there are many cases where, let's say, a carrier makes inefficient use of routing resources on the internet. There are weekly reports that go out to say, hey, you're using too much, but those are parties that are, very technical and are used to being involved in a global community of, shared resources. That's not really the case here.
Chuck.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and obviously the users in many cases are kind of in the dark about exactly what's going on. I think in many cases what I'm observing is that the platform vendors, the device vendors, are increasingly trying to provide information on those devices about what network data traffic usage is being driven by different applications, because that actually can impact the user. And one of the examples of the wall of shame that we uncovered in some of the work that Marcus was describing is there was a Sudoku application that was just driving incredible amount of bandwidth. So here you are playing Sudoku, which shouldn't use any bandwidth other than to download the app. And it's I don't know what it's doing, but it's driving a lot of usage. So users really do need to know. Unfortunately, the signaling load that Jen described is much more subtle, because that really does affect the battery usage, and it can severely affect the network, but it's not something the users got any direct incentive other than the battery to be conscious of. And hopefully the notion behind the working with the developers is that to the extent that the users, the network, and the application developers' incentives are all aligned, in most of these cases they are, because if you're reducing the network usage, you're reducing the battery usage, which benefits the user. When those incentives are all aligned, you can encourage, the application developers will want to do the right thing. And that's the sort of the premise that we've had in working directly with the application developer community.
Got it. Neil?
Charles has pretty much covered what I was going to say, which is certainly Android exposes battery life usage in a pretty clear way by apps, by infrastructure, by layer, and so on. So the app developer certainly has the incentive to optimize this stuff.
Got it. Kevin?
One of the, as you talk through this, I think of, it's kind of like how green is my app standpoint. And as I think through some of the challenges that the committee raised, I kind of do compare and contrast for wireline and wireless, and some of the deltas I see between them is like mobility, but a lot of the same. How efficient is it? Wasteful? Is it? Is there a lot of things going on that the user doesn't know about it? It's a lot of commonality between the two.
Are apps heterogeneous enough that it would be really hard to articulate optimization standards for them? I imagine the standards you'd have for a video app would be very different for Sudoku. It would be obvious which ones should be. But so does that make it hard to actually think about developing?
Yeah, I think that is fair, Jonathan. I think each app has a different time constant for when it needs information. If we think about machines, as Jennifer pointed out, some of those are life critical and need to be able to send information absolutely immediately, and some are more hourly updates. And so it's going to have to be a heterogeneous environment we look at, which is why I think the idea of having a signaling proxy isn't a bad one, because it simply says it knows the type of app potentially, and then maybe can make a decision about, is this a mission-critical app that needs to be in front of the queue, or is it something that can wait a little bit? Yet the request is there to say send now, and its intelligence could be a little bit about that type of app, that class of app needs to communicate immediately, and it just makes a very lightweight.
Or even at least compel the app to have to say and opt in up front, this really matters.
This really matters
and
now.
the signaling proxy is like, okay, if you say so.
Exactly. So there should be an override that says, I know I normally don't need this, but right now I do, right? And so that would be the type of...
There's a crossword puzzle emergency right now.
Or an Angry Bird emergency.
So I think a related challenge, I think a number of these applications generate periodic traffic because they're trying to keep a connection and a network address translator alive. And so there's a lot of mystery there. That box is lying passively in the network. It's not visible to the application, and the application may not know what timeout that box is using. So in theory, it should pull just under that timeout window to keep its connection alive in the NAT. But if it doesn't know what parameter it's using, it could very easily be much more aggressive than it needs to be. So I think some sort of feedback there, or different mechanisms for managing network address translators, or at least different ways to convey to the application how it should be adapting its own timers based on that would be really useful.
Good point. Got it. Yes, Neil?
It seems to me that application developers are enormously creative, and if you expose the mechanisms of resource contention and power consumption, all the rest of it, they'll figure out all kinds of interesting ways to work around it, whether that's being predictive about the need for this, that, and the other, and sort of getting ahead of the game to, the map that's tracking progress as you drive along the highway pretty much knows which panels, which tiles it's going to need to load, and it could load a whole bunch of them in advance if the app developer is aware of the constraints and the pieces there. So I suspect there's a big solution piece here is being very clear and very open about what the constraints are, and people have at it.
I would say that's true, but the problem obviously with mobility is changing cell to cell to cell to cell. So the app would need to be able to optimize continuously for the congested state of the particular cell the user was on in order to really optimally deliver it, as opposed to take a sort of best guess at what it should do. To really be optimal, it would need to know the instantaneous state of the particular cell the user was on. So that's what makes it difficult for the app to be the only thing that does it, as opposed to having an assist function.
Makes sense, and to the extent that there are sort of deeper level APIs that allow the app to query and to be aware of what's going on, that would sort of open things up for a lot of efficiency.
So before we depart the substance of this topic, I want to have some license to cold call David Clark, who said he wanted to make sure we had fun. Are we having fun yet, David? Is this...
Yeah, sure. I mean, at a very high level, this is a disappointing conversation to me because what I mean is
Odd definition of fun.
We always hoped in the internet that somehow we'd done a good job of insulating the application from the variations in the technology down below. That was the fantasy of the narrow waist, and I'm reminded of a talk that Steve Deering gave years ago, in which the title of the talk, for those of you who are familiar with the hourglass picture that I've drawn on the internet, and the narrow waist was supposed to imply that's all you need to know up above in order to take advantage of what's down below. And Steve gave a talk, the title of which was Putting on Weight at the Waist. And what he was pointing out is there's more and more stuff actually sticking out. And in the 1990s, we thought maybe we could deal with some of this by giving you this abstraction called quality of service. And when now you think about the complexity of the signaling interface and all this kind of stuff, and people saying, well, the application has to adapt to the underlying technology. And, you know, that's actually a painful erosion of a fundamental principle. And so I think people who would like to back up and think about this philosophically should say, can we maybe undo some of that and give the application designers a new abstraction that is a little more realistic, but doesn't require them to learn the difference between Wi-Fi and 3 kinds of cellular systems. But that's not the job of the committee. It's sort of a takeaway for me.
The proxy seems to be an approximation of exactly that, right?
Yes. Well, maybe, and I don't know. I will have to go think about that. But at the same time, the other thing that's coming up here that seems very important is people have said, can we align the incentives of the actors? And you know, the users don't know what's going on, so it's really hard. I mean, human being kind of users, not application. They're users too. They're humans too. But it's very hard for an ordinary user to understand why his battery ran down, right? So it's hard to give him the incentives to behave properly. And I don't know what the correct incentive is. If the application designer had to, if the application designer had to pay for the bandwidth, things would really change, right? But we didn't want to do it that way. So I think the other fundamental question, which might be closer to the scope of this committee, is it's not advice to the FCC, but what can we do to better align the incentives of the actors given the reality of what's going on here? That's my answer to you. Cold call them, you get a philosophy answer, right?
Thank you. Dennis.
But I think one quick response to that is with your hourglass and all the rest. We didn't, when we were creating the internet, really envision wireless in the way that it exists today. At least that would not be my perception, being old enough to be there at that time as well. And that has really made a considerable difference. And that's really why, of course, we have this subcommittee focused on wireless to begin with. But the constraints of limited bandwidth, the constraint of limited battery, the constraint of movement so that you have to be mindful of cells and their varying capacities and the like, those really weren't the considerations when the internet was being envisioned in my mind. But you can adjust my thinking if you have an
I was going to leap to the defense of the early designers a little bit to point out that the second network that was built into the internet after the ARPANET was the packet radio net. And that worked so poorly that in one case, in order to get connectivity between one side of a hill and another, we had to put a packet radio in a Jeep and drive it back and forth and drive the packets over the top of the hill with a Jeep. So we knew that wireless networks sucked in 1978, but we had
that was 10 years into the cycle in 78.
Ooh.
The internet was being envisioned in the late 60s.
No, I'm sorry, that's the ARPANET.
The ARPANET, okay.
Forgive me. But the point is, what we didn't know is any way to think about this other than to tell application designers that their applications had, in some sense, to be infinitely adaptable to available bandwidth. That was the only piece of advice we know how to give them because we didn't know what else to say. And the second order effects like dropouts and so forth, we just didn't know how to think about it. And in fact, Steve Deering defended for the entire period of his history until he gave up in frustration, the idea that applications should essentially be told that they should be infinitely adaptable. But again, you have to give them the feedback. And they know if they're running out of bandwidth. They can tell that they're running out of bandwidth. They can't tell if they're draining the battery. Or they can't tell in the same way. They'd have to go look at some other parameter if they're running down the battery. And you know what you're doing if you're using too much bandwidth, which is change your coding. You sort of how to adapt. But what do I do if I'm running the battery down? I don't know. So I think the answer is we just don't know how to model it. Okay.
Well, the other, I will add the one other piece to what you just said, which is the mobility aspect, which can very rapidly change the amount of bandwidth is to be had.
Horribly.
As well. Yeah. So the fact that you were perfectly supplied with bandwidth at one moment, and then you went around the corner and switched base stations, and now you have a dearth of bandwidth, is something also that the internet doesn't know really how to deal with very well.
I think I'd add one thing is I think there's also another ingredient. It's the end user has started having a perception requirement. So minimum bandwidth usage isn't actually, applications being infinitely adaptive don't take account of the end user's perception of that rule. And it might be the end user's perception is actually very poor for that being a guiding principle, because certain applications they really care about. And so going to minimum bandwidth for all applications is not necessarily the right answer. And I think that's the complexity too, no matter whether it's a fixed or a mobile network.
Mm-hmm. So we should move on to our next subject, but before we, oops, sorry, Leslie.
Thanks. I was trying to be patient. I'm practicing a new trick.
May not serve you well with this group.
I just wanted to comment that to the question of proxies and whether or not, well, Dave's noodling on that. I think a part of the question is, where do you perceive the edge of the internet to be? Is it on the actual device, or is it somewhere else in the network, and you've got something going on between your device and that proxy? And I think the other question about, that leads to a question about what do you do about the various congestion problems in many different flavors that we're no doubt going to talk about more in the other working group readouts. There's a lot of work that needs to be looked at in terms of managing congestion and other traffic flow management in a general way for the internet. So I'm still optimistic that these worlds will converge in some constructive way. When we hosted a panel discussion about how do mobile devices differ from RFC 1123 compliant hosts on the internet, about 2 years ago, the key overriding concern was mobile hosts and their battery life, and the fact that even from the standpoint of forget the network, forget about the issues with chattiness that Jen's report brought up, you can't afford to run your phone down so that you can't make emergency service calls. So there's a whole other set of considerations in question of what is an internet host requirement set these days that also comes into play to make kind of a three-way tug. But again, I'm optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Michelle?
Yeah, Jennifer, you mentioned that going to work with third parties to help clarify some of the technical context. I think that there's definitely an opportunity where I'm on the transparency working group, that there's definitely, you came back to this reasonable network management, and that's, the work of the transparency group is to help define that. And while I'm going to give an update at the end of this session, we've been collecting a lot of information of what are the broadband providers do for disclosure on their network management, and I think that we could do some work on the mobile. What are the mobile carriers? How do they disclose what their network management practices are, which play into how do the app developers and end users, it all carries down. So we can help. I think there's some overlap where the two groups can work together.
That's great. I would just add that I think it'd be nice in that to capture practices for managing signaling resources, which might not be something an end user would read in a report of exactly what the management practices are as part of their billing plan, but would be really useful anyway for the kind of issues we were just discussing.
Definitely.
That's great. That could be a nice handoff from one group to the other. And we should probably just note that all of this is against the backdrop of the Open Internet Rule, which specifies certain non-discrimination obligations on wireline that do not completely carry over into the wireless space. And the ones that do carry over are the transparency rule. So that's even more of a reason perhaps to be having the transparency working group focusing on that, and the prohibition on blocking websites or applications that might compete with the provider's voice or video telephony services. And that's a different bucket than reasonable network management, which may well be the touchstone in wireline. So, all right. So Jennifer, last question before we move on is, do you have a sense of where the working group is going next, and will there be some opportunity to capture this dynamic presentation in some form that maybe could go upward?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, we want to write up these examples and the third example on Google Wallet that we didn't have time to present today. So some short 2 or 3 pager just sort of summarizing maybe one more level of detail than the talk did. That's the first goal. The second, and I think is this sort of handoff with the transparency working group, is something that would be great to discuss. Third is we need to dig a little more into technical details, and I struggle a little bit with exactly how deep to go, and because our group is not primarily meant to be a technical group. So figuring out exactly how much we need to learn to be able to have more meaningful discussions about management practice and where to hand off to others where it gets more technical.
Great. Terrific. Thank you. Why don't we now turn to specialized services and look over to you for a non-cold call.
I don't have slides. I think this group has struggled a little bit to get started. Perhaps that's because I was foolishly hoping we could have a conversation without the discipline of repeated phone calls, which Jen did. We will now move to phone calls. But
you could use FaceTime if you want.
Yes, right. But part of the problem, and this becomes very clear, and I think people understand it, is this is actually a very difficult topic to discuss. And let me, for the benefit of people who haven't picked up on this, let me just give a little bit of background of what's going on here. If you go back to the original Open Internet Report and Order, in the introduction to that, there is a paragraph that says, "We recognize that broadband providers may offer other services over the same last-mile connection used to provide broadband service. These specialized services can benefit end users and spur investment." Parenthetically, they don't say investment in what. "But they may also present risks to the open internet. We will closely monitor specialized services and their effects on broadband service to ensure through all available mechanisms that they supplement but do not supplant the open internet." And then later on in the order, there's a section, if anybody is so moved to go read this, paragraph 112 is in a section titled Specialized Services. And they talk about specialized services such as some broadband providers' existing facilities-based VoIP and Internet Protocol video offerings, which is interesting because what they've done in that case is they've expanded the definition of specialized service to include essentially all the things that operators do over their broadband last mile, which isn't internet. And having thrown that net widely, they then go on to say that the Open Internet Advisory Committee will aid us in monitoring these issues. So that's our charter. Now, there was a lot of commentary that was given to the FCC both in advance of the report and order and afterwards. And in some respects, the commentary is not surprising if you understand the perspectives of the users. The operators are very clear that an integrated system, a converged system in which everything is over IP, is economically efficient. It would be stupid, and I think I would agree, although as a chairman I suppose I shouldn't be taking positions too quickly, that it would seem stupid. It would be a perverse incentive if the rules were set up in such a way that operators were driven to deconverge their network. And somebody succinctly pointed out, what's the difference between digital content being delivered in IP packets and digital content being delivered in some other kind of stuff? I think it's clear over the next maybe 10 years, I don't know, Kevin can tell me, that probably most of digital video coming down to your set-top box will be in IP packets. But does that change its regulatory history? And that's a very slippery and dangerous space because, of course, with respect to telephony, some of the telephone operators have been arguing that the move of circuit-based telephony to IP, not internet, but IP, is an occasion to revisit the regulatory standing, in particular to obtain some regulatory relief from Title II. But if technology is a basis for arguing that you would change your regulatory rules, then if television moves to IP, would that be an occasion to change the regulatory rules? What I've just said has probably caused 3 people up there to want to hit me with a lightning bolt before I go any further. And this has been why it's been hard to get a discussion going, because in fact what you're doing here is trying to draw some sort of bright line on a slippery slope. And it's pretty clear that once we have a global network of private or managed IP connectivity, which is not the internet, global services could be offered over that, something that I might call better than Skype, could have better quality of service, no dropouts, available to anybody, video, HD audio, but it's not over the public internet. Should the FCC be concerned that that's unfairly competing with Skype? I would note that, of course, the internet itself is a tremendous source of competition to people who thought that they were previously in well-defined businesses like cable TV, and nobody's wept bitter tears for them. So I think that this is an area where the committee really needs to figure out what it can reasonably say. One of the comments was, we don't actually know what it means to monitor. What are we supposed to be doing? Sitting around waiting for bad things in capital letters to happen so that we can look at them? Is this a case study situation, such as which Jen has used to try to get some traction here? We could look at case studies. Some of the case studies are very visible. But again, I think part of what we struggle with here as a committee is what is the limit of our ability to have a conversation and give useful advice to the FCC in a situation in which I think both the authority is uncertain and the slope is very slippery. So those of you who've been exchanging email with me on the internet over this may wish to give me some further comments or fill in. I think I'm personally sympathetic to the position of most of the people here. I think it is a slippery space in which all of the positions have merit, and I would like to think that we could give the FCC some advice, because if not us, who? They'll probably do something. Does anybody from the committee wish to respond? Or
and can we just have people who are on that working group self-identify for a moment? Great. Anybody want to weigh in? Yep, Neil?
I feel like there's certainly a lot of very, very interesting questions. And as David will understand, I'm a relative latecomer to participating in the discussion here. It feels to me like one of the interesting questions is, what are the competitive forces, the market forces that help to shape what constitutes adequate and effective delivery of open internet across a pipe that's potentially a monopoly, a duopoly, or a small number of competitors competing to deliver those kinds of services, and where the pipe is shared between competing different alternatives. And that, to me, is what makes this a fascinating question to debate. So again, it's the competitive forces or the lack of competitive forces governing what constitutes adequate internet delivery across a constrained pipe.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that there's a lot of challenges here. But on the other hand, I also feel like there's something that we call internet service, and we might have something of a pretty good collective idea of what that is. Like, it might not be that hard for us to come to some agreement about what is internet service. And then there's some things that are clearly not going to be internet service. And we, I think, might be able to sort of sort out what some of those are, maybe by doing case studies. I thought Jen very, very capably led us through case studies in the mobile group, and that worked well. And so maybe by looking at those two sets of things, like things that we know are internet service and things that we clearly feel that are really not internet service, we can try to sort of elucidate, well, what is it about these things that are not internet service that makes them that and distinguishes them? And if we tweaked one parameter or another, would that change the game? And then we would have a set of things to analyze and say, if we put all these together, how do they impact what is sitting there on the internet service side of the pipe? So I definitely agree that when you think about everything converging all over one pipe, it gets very confusing. But on the other hand, I feel like we have some intuitive notion of the differences between these things, and whether we can add some rigor to that intuition, I think might be worth finding out.
The ever-patient Leslie.
I like this trick. Yeah, so I think that following on what Alyssa just said, I think part of the challenge is that even as things are converging, it's a convergence of things that we have understood separately. But maybe now it's time to pull them apart a little bit and actually look at how do the different pieces, different layers fit together. So instead of thinking of, for instance, telephony or voice over IP as competing services, think about it as, voice delivery to known endpoints as a service separately from how the bits are getting from one place to another. Because if we think of it as cable service and phone service and internet service colliding, we wind up in that world of hurt that David outlined so clearly. And, as Alyssa said, I think we can probably come up with a pretty clear idea of what is internet service. Instead of lining that up against, I think we should line that up against the other application services that are getting delivered. Let each of those services be competitive and figure out what that means in a regulatory environment, and separately figure out what it means given, limited physical access to deliver to endpoints. What does it mean to have competitive access over the last mile, so on and so forth. But if you merge those two things, the services and delivery together, you wind up in a very complex articulation of the world as we know it today, and I would be afraid that we would have very little ability to move forward into whatever the world of tomorrow brings, because if nothing else, the internet has demonstrated that we have, very little capacity to articulate what that's going to be with any certainty.
Chuck?
Yeah, great conversation. I have a number of points, and I think there's certainly some things here that are worthy of following up on. I guess just to keep it brief, sort of two things. One is that I think, as Dave you articulated, I think the evidence it should be fairly clear that internet access, certainly in the United States, is a net beneficiary of specialized services rather than the other way around. They provide an economic incentive for the service providers to deploy faster, better networks. And at least, I think it would be very useful to see if there's any data that would, or evidence that would indicate that up until this point, there's that specialized services are crowding out internet access.
And Chuck, I
think the evidence is to the contrary.
And maybe just to be clear for everyone, because it's a very vague sounding category. When you say specialized services in that sentence, what do you mean?
So I think Dave alluded to it, and obviously there are some definitions that are in the Internet Order. The term managed services is also used.
Yes.
So, and these are services that are provided by the operator over an access infrastructure that may be based on IP, but is not necessarily a part of or even connected to the global internet.
So examples could be telephony
VoIP,
with your regular phone, television.
Entertainment quality video service, such as AT&T's UVerse service, voice over IP services. As many of you know, most of the wireline carriers are essentially they're doing a forklift upgrade of the infrastructure that's supporting telephony service. You are probably getting at least some portion of the wireline phone calls that you're making today have an infrastructure that's voice over IP, although the service appearance to the consumer is identical to the service appearance that they may have had 25 years ago. So it's a technology substitution, as it were, for a legacy service, is often the case for a voice over internet protocol type of a service. So that's sort of one general comment around specialized services, and I'll sort of cap that. And there's a second point that I also think is important for this group to consider, and it just occurred to me over the course of the last week that I've not heard it brought up by anybody on this committee. I have the opportunity to spend time occasionally with AT&T's chief security officer, and it's actually within the last couple of weeks we've seen an increasing number of both internet infrastructure attacks and also a significant increase that has been very consistent, but also recently has significantly ramped up in what are known as advanced persistent threats. And to me, it's a little bit ironic because we all have this somewhat idealized notion of an open internet, and I think we all, to Alyssa's point, actually aspire to preserve some of that vision. And it's a very attractive thing. It has a narrow waist and so on. But the reality is that particular vision grew up in an era when essentially all of the contributors and participants in the internet ecosystem were researchers that knew each other. And I will posit that actually the biggest threat to the internet today is not ISPs essentially doing nefarious things, but actually the infrastructure attacks that are coming from outside our borders. And it's very likely, I would say that I would predict that within the next couple of years, it's very likely that we will see an internet scale outage as a result of these attacks. So if this committee is interested in preserving the future of the internet, I think there's something, I don't know whether this is a regulatory issue or not, I don't know if it's in the purview of the FCC or not, but when I think about what is the biggest threat to the future of the internet, it's probably security issues rather than any of the things that we've been talking about today.
Yeah. Being open internet, we may well be able to construe our purview widely, although I do know that within FCC and elsewhere, there are already lots of committees looking very carefully at the cybersecurity space and how to deal with that. And there might even be moments where you could see a dialogue among them. David, are we going to hop in quickly on that?
Well, I would completely support what he said, and of course I'm totally cynical. I think the comment that the Lutz Committee is talking about it is exactly a good way to demonstrate there's no progress.
Uh-huh.
And I hope that we can do better than that, but in the security area, I am sort of like, 20 dB frustrated.
Uh-huh.
So, it's...
That's earplug frustrated.
That's right,
Yeah.
You got it. So this is a really serious issue, and I could imagine some services moving from the open internet to a managed network precisely because even though it's the same technology and therefore it's easy to migrate, it's a more closed environment and therefore more secure. People who today are letting their operators run SCADA systems remotely from the home, which strikes everybody as insane. Seems to me there's an obvious...
SCADA systems being dams, bridges...
Water supplies.
Yes.
Yes, right. All these electric systems, generators.
There maybe shouldn't be an app for that, is what you're saying.
Well, so to me, a company with a very well-developed private IP network could easily go to the operator of a power company and say, look, if you want your operators to operate remotely, we'll do this for you over the managed network. And it's a closed system. The crazy people can't get in. But you don't have to do any different because it's still IP. To me, that's an obvious and pretty arguable kind of business opportunity, and it basically says let's exploit the security you get not from fixing the technology, but from just doing a better job of keeping the creepy people out.
Now, we intentionally weighted the working group presentations towards the mobile broadband, so we should move on shortly, but I know Kevin wanted to weigh in and Brad too. Kevin?
So one thing I wanted to say is Dave started this out with, it is a bit of a slippery slope, and I think the security element brings into it, if you can't do specialized services, maybe you can't offer those types of security-based services. But I go back to, we're talking about security and capacity and other things, this problem is not new, right? The challenge around capacity is not new. It started with rights of way, and then it was conduits, and then it was wires, and then it was spectrum, and at each stage there was more innovation, there was more capacity added, and I think if the challenge is capacity and preventing the future dirt road element, there's a lot of eyes looking at this from all different angles, from government, internal, external, looking at the capacity challenge and making sure that we avoid the dirt road and the system's working, we continue to have innovation. So I think we have to be really careful of saying, we can't innovate because of concerns.
If bandwidth were infinite, there wouldn't be a worry about specialized services. And what I hear you saying is we're making progress on keeping bandwidth going such that ideally we'd minimize that conflict.
Right.
Uh-huh. Brad?
So the other, listening to David is talking about the possibility of moving off of the open internet onto a specialized network is actually pretty discouraging to me, given his background, because one of the things that you get with the open internet is the opportunity to innovate at the edge. And a worry that I have in holding out security as the reason for centralizing control over the internet is the loss of that innovation. And for example, I think Michelle's company is doing a lot of very interesting work in security, and it wouldn't be possible if she had to ask permission of the underlying network provider to deploy her services. And so I want to make sure that we don't end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater here by, focusing on security at the expense of the freedom to innovate.
Yes. Well, David, I think you've managed to convey that this is a deep and thorny and really interesting and possibly scary problem. Maybe we should close out by simply trying to ask, is there any other set of resources or processes, aside from more phone calls, that you see as helping the working group in its mission?
What we have to do as we meet after lunch is basically see if we can identify some questions on which we can make some progress. I think this idea, well, there may be some things that are clearly in bounds because they're not internet. Okay.
This is getting to Alyssa's point about let's identify the endpoints.
That may be a way to start. So I think we have a couple of ways we can start here. The problem, and I think this question of what we're monitoring is a good one. The point is, all of this, including the report and order itself, is really trying to constrain something that's going to happen in the future. As Kevin said, we don't know how this is going to play out. And so is this a go slow time? Is this a go fast time? But that's what we're really going to discuss. So I don't think there's more resources. I think we just need to work very hard to see what the committee can actually do.
Terrific.
So doodle time.
All right. And with that, we move to check in with Shane and the Economic Impacts Group. Who's on the Economic Impacts Working Group here? 1, 2, 3? Yep. 4? Shane?
Well, Dave Clark's always a hard act to follow. When he tries to lower expectations, he still delivers a concerto afterwards. When I try to lower expectations, I do it because I'm not going to deliver anything. So we also have struggled over the question of where to go. I also feel somewhat responsible. My standing mode of communication with most of my students is by email, and I'm an instant emailer, but as it turns out, most of the other committee members are not. And so that was probably an error on my part. And so I think we will also go to scheduled group phone meetings as well. So what has happened in the meantime is two things. First, on the one hand, the set of issues that motivated this subcommittee in the first place were put together and reviewed. Economic impacts of the open internet framework is, there were lots of debates back in the day about whether this would have any economic impact or not. And so a list was put together of what those arguments were, and that's, that will be circulated to help remind everyone that there really were there seemed to be some burning questions on the table. The second thing that happened in the meantime was, I did put out this call to the committee members about a potential agenda that didn't get translated into an actual agenda yet. But the prospect of hanging had a way of focusing the mind, and so a few people at the last minute did suggest some questions and identify some potential questions, and those rolled in at just the last minute. And so it was too last minute to actually have a useful filtering through group discussion. And so I'm just going to say we had 4 questions that really came in well-defined ways. We were discussing it beforehand to have 4 questions for this committee. It was not the 4 questions, why is this committee different from all other committees? Sometime in April that will become more appropriate. In fact, but the 4 questions that seem to be well-defined, I'm just going to put them out there. As I said, they're no priority. Whether they're all potential, they're not actual. Committee members, we'd love to get, if any of these strike your fancy as useful for thinking about an agenda. So here they are. So one question that came over is the following: is there any evidence regarding the impact of the order on investment in infrastructure, such as content delivery networks or caching, or particular evidence of content providers paying for better transport directly, which the order discourages, which is the reason why that's an interesting question. Another interesting question that's come over is the following. Have application providers and wireless networks offered to pay for usage charges incurred by users? Which is another thing that was bandied back and forth in advance of the order. Here's another question. Question number 3. What is the evidence, if any, that data caps have had any economic impact on the wireline broadband network and the ecosystems built around it? Another question. And then number 4, are there different responses to different approaches to the open internet regulations across countries? For example, more or fewer quality of service deals in countries where the regulatory structure is open to them. And as I said, I don't have a position on which of these questions is best suited for the committee, if one or all of them, but I would certainly be happy to hear opinions about that.
Great. And your working group, of course, along with the others, is meeting immediately after this meeting. I guess maybe an invitation specifically to people not on the working group, if there's anything anybody wants to put in to that hopper, this would be a time to do it.
I mean, I've spent some time looking at the FCC collected data from, I think it's called the 477 reports, is that right?
Yep.
And so far, both on the fixed and the wired side of things, there doesn't seem to be any obvious attenuation of broadband capacity. So I do think, building off the point that Kevin made, it would be interesting to look at, given where we have come. In fact, the data goes back to 1994, I think. So we've got almost 20 years of data. What is it that we are worried about in those curves? Have we seen things that correlate with economic phenomena, or do the economics and those growth curves not correlate? So is measuring broadband capacity an effective way to judge the health of an industry, or are they unrelated? Because if you look at them, there doesn't seem to be an issue in increasing by more than twofold in capacity every year. And so that would seem to be one of the healthiest industries you could imagine, even outstripping Moore's law in some ways. So I think that we should calibrate on, is there an economic correlation to that you can look at? And the data exists, and so if you could put markers saying these are the things that happened at each point in time that actually drove that next wave, that would be interesting to see, because you do see jumps in these curves. We think they're technology jumps, meaning the next technology rolls out. But what drives that next technology to roll out would be an interesting economic question. Who paid for it?
I appreciate the question.
So if you're going to examine that, I worry a little bit that you wouldn't want to look at it strictly from the capacity perspective or from the network perspective. Looking at the applications that drive the usage would also be important. So you're not capturing Facebook usage and Twitter usage and in looking to, at just capacity. And I think that may be the thing that's driving,
An interesting example there would be the introduction of Wi-Fi for really short hop has a transformational effect on things, but doesn't necessarily get reflected in a capacity figure for the network.
Yeah, because you wouldn't show up in broadband,
right? Exactly.
Se, would it? Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yep. Chuck?
So I haven't thought about your 4 questions. In fact, I only heard 3 of them, so I'll have to get the 4th one later. But there is a white paper that I was actually reading on the train on the way up here that I'll share with you. It's about, I think it's about a year old, but the analysis done in that paper shows that I think overall the consumer spend on wireless services in the United States continues to decline while usage continues to go up. So in essence, consumers are getting more and more value for less and less money over a historically fairly significant period. And also the amount that the consumers in the United States spend for wireless services is significantly lower than a lot of other countries in the world. So basically, the ecosystem in this country is continuing to deliver more and more capability for less and less money. So if you want to exactly what we do with that fact, I don't know, but since this is about economic impacts, it seems like a white paper that you guys might want to look at.
Yeah, sure. Please send it.
Great. David?
I guess I just have to jump in and say, if you're going to look at those two parameters, you also need to look at the comparative quality of experience between this country and some other countries as well. Certainly my friends from Europe say that we are living in a wireless third world country here, which is slightly harsh, but perhaps there's another dimension to this, which is underinvestment. It's a hypothesis to test, right, if you're going to look at those two measures. I must be in a bad mood today.
Well, Shane, it does seem like your cup runneth over with possible questions to investigate. So,
I suspect that the issue is actually that the usage is so much higher here that keeping up with deploying adequate capacity is causing some of the reaction that your friends from Europe are seeing. But again, data would be necessary to really answer it.
Yeah, Neil.
I have a chart that plots Moore's Law progress of what I can get at home for $50 a month. And it starts in 1984 with a 110 baud modem. And it plots up, and almost all the technology changes lie right on that doubling every 18 months of price performance. And if you extrapolate that line forward for from the first 20 years out to now, I should be getting 100 megabits for $50. And I'm getting 12 megabits for $100, and I feel like I'm 3 generations behind, and I'm not seeing that Moore's Law that you guys are talking about.
Well, it does sound like you started off disadvantaged too. If you were only at 110 baud in 1984, I was at 1200 or 24. I got to say,
I pretty quickly got 300 and 1900 and 5600. I mean, I've had the selection. It seems like on a price performance of the consumer. It isn't evenly spread if it's there. It'd be interesting to compare notes on exactly what that comes to.
Yeah. Well, a meta question might be just how data hungry and data processing hungry that working group should be. Shane, that might be your call. Do it that way. Great. If there are no further comments on economic impacts, let's talk about transparency. And who's on the transparency working group? Great.
Leslie,
it's rather opaque who's on the group, but over to you, Michelle.
Sure. So Russ, who is the chair of our committee, couldn't be here today, or of our working group, so I'm going to deliver our update. Our group has had a slow start, but we've started to make progress, and where we started was, where can we add the most value, as the transparency group? And often you hear these 3 words, reasonable network management. Often everyone comes back to these 3 words. And so we spent some time starting by saying, what do people currently disclose? So looking at all the broadband providers and all the wireless providers, there's this idea of there's supposed to be disclosure of their network management practices. So where do you find that? What does it say? And is it easy to understand? How technical is the explanation? And so we're in the very early stages of information gathering. We're just literally going to comcast.net.com and finding where do they list their network management practices, having the link, and then collecting all of those resources. So we're in the information gathering stage. Where we see this going forward is doing a little bit more of analysis of what are the differences between what the providers are doing. Does that make a difference? What people disclose, is it easy to understand? How technical do you have to be to be able to understand it? What sort of impact that has? And then now, based on the work that the mobile group is doing, making sure that we really look at what the mobile carriers are doing. I mean, it's been there, but having more of an emphasis of that of, are they disclosing their network management practices? In what way? If not, what's the impact of that? And so that's kind of the update from our group.
And I guess there's always a question of how granular a disclosure should be.
Yes.
Saying we reserve the right or we do manage the network for reasonable purposes may be less granular than we don't allow FaceTime or something. Right.
Yes.
Yep, Jennifer?
So 2 quick things. One I kind of mentioned earlier. I think it'd be really interesting to look at what level of transparency one would have or how one would specify a management practice for consumers, for people that are on the policy side to check if a particular practice is obeying any particular constraints there might be on those practices, and what might be appropriate for researchers or others who might be inclined to try to measure and verify that a management practice is actually being followed. And that last category is actually quite challenging because it's very difficult to articulate a management practice in a machine-readable form. And you could imagine that as a goal, but I think it's probably not a reasonable one. And also management practices that are verifiable or measurable, and that's also quite challenging. So I don't know exactly, but it seems like there's three different groups: consumers, people looking at policy, and people looking at actually verifying a particular practice might need different levels of information.
Great. Yep, Shane?
I would just add, not to narrow the question just to users. I mean, as was brought up earlier, developers sometimes need to know things, and that's, it's possible to facilitate economic growth by making it quite easy for information to flow about what technically a developer needs to do. Not asking operators to disclose proprietary information, but where the right boundary is, so that everyone's clear about how to make their apps work on the edge of the network everywhere.
Definitely.
We don't want things balkanizing either.
And whether for the developer or the user, it might be very helpful to somehow have one-stop shopping for those practices. And there ought to be some way, this is where somebody waves a wand and says XML, to somehow push the different practices out to...
To be clear, there's a trade-off here too. You don't want to burden operators either. I mean, it's don't want to want to find the easy things here.
Yes.
This is Jessica on the phone. Can I jump in?
Please.
Is the committee also looking at which languages the disclosures are being made in, particularly languages that the operators advertise in?
Typically, we've just been looking at the English version, but that's a good metric to start to collect. So I've added it to our list.
Great, thank you. Because one thing we like to look at is not only whether it's available in Spanish and other threshold languages, but whether the explanation is culturally relevant, because a direct translation doesn't always work.
Thank
and I'm
you.
happy to help with that.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Alyssa?
Yeah, just to pick up on this sort of list of other things you could be looking at. So I think static disclosures are one thing, but then there's also been at least, I don't know if in the U.S., but certainly in other countries, some innovation around other kinds of tools and more just-in-time notice or interactive sort of ways to present information to consumers about how much data they've used or which applications are, causing them to near their data cap and that sort of things. So I think that, beyond just looking at the disclosures that might be available to everyone, it's probably worth looking at some of the more targeted tools that are only available to customers of the particular services. And then my second point, just to kind of pick up on something that Jonathan just said, also in Europe, there's been a lot more work on standardized disclosure. And in the country that I know best, the UK, because the market is extremely competitive, there are lots of these comparison websites. And one of the goals of the regulatory effort there has been to create a standardized disclosure that the comparison websites could then automatically consume and display that information, so that as consumers are shopping for broadband services, they can see, a side-by-side comparison of what the management practices are. So it might just be worth looking a little bit, and I know the European Commission through BEREC, the organization of the national regulators, has done a bunch of research about which kinds of transparency seem to get through to people and which elements are more appropriate for standardized notice and that kind of thing. So it might just be helpful to inform the rest of the work of the group. Great.
So, Michelle, that seems to be some good agenda setting, which is what I gather the group will be. That's the phase you're in right now. Anything else that might be helpful from the committee, resource-wise or substance-wise?
No, I think that's very helpful.
Great. All right, with that, our working group check-in is done, and we should just turn briefly to the question, I shudder to ask, do we want more working groups? And for that, I believe, Neil, you had brought up the prospect, that is to say, Netflix had brought up the prospect of a formation of an interconnection best practices working group and a formation of a data cap working group. Is there anything you'd briefly like to say to either? And I would say maybe our project would be, it's not just sort of, do we think this is a good topic, but are there ways in which maybe those topics could be explored in the infrastructure we have? But please.
Yes, so let's start with an interconnection best practices proposal. I think the key question here is how does the traffic get from content providers or service providers to the end user, and what are the economic forces that govern and steer who pays whom for which bits of which kind of infrastructure? And I think it would be fascinating to undertake some case studies. It'd be interesting to look at some situations about how that ought to be structured. Certainly, the experience we have across different countries is quite illuminating in terms of how things work in different countries and the implication of that in terms of provision of services to consumers. And I think there's some fascinating work to do in terms of how that would shape the future of the internet from a consumer's perspective.
Uh-huh. And do you want to say a word or two about the caps too?
Sure. The data caps one is a relevant question illustrated by the Comcast Xbox caps, no caps question. A lot of the same kinds of considerations apply. To the caps make a good vehicle for governing and steering users' use of the internet. The internet capacity is obviously limited by a number of factors, principally peak bandwidth, and caps are measuring distributed bits. So it seems like it's an easy to understand concept, but it's not particularly well tuned to the capacity we're trying to share around and govern. And the pricing of data beyond the cap seems to have little relationship to the costs involved in delivery beyond the cap, and certainly the impact on consumers in environments and regimes where data caps are widely deployed, widely socialized, and charged at a high rate is interesting and illuminating to look at. You look at Canada with a lot of capping going on, and you look at the consumer impact in terms of willingness to engage in certain kinds of behavior and activity. And consumers really have no concept of what a 50 gig cap looks like or how much usage they can get. And, they worry about sending an email, which is clearly in the wrong dimension altogether. And so I think examining the economic and user impact of caps and exploring whether there are alternative ways to do a better job of allocating scarce resources, whether that's the signaling stuff we kicked off with earlier, whether it's peak capacity, whether it's capacity at particular times, with sort of peak rate billing. There's lots of different ways we can imagine putting together a structure that might be much more effective than caps at delivering the required results for both the infrastructure providers and for the consumer-facing businesses.
Got it.
That would be fun and interesting to look at.
Any thoughts on these two ideas that people want to offer here? Yep.
I certainly think that these are both very interesting topics. I don't know if the caps thing is already in the economic impact group. They mentioned caps. I don't know if it fits there or needs another group. That's an open question. But certainly I think the interconnection topic sounds discrete. To me, but also very, ultimately very important.
One could see some of the caps, even as you said, was mentioned, fitting into economic impacts. And the part of the caps that might be differential, waived for certain services for certain reasons, might fit into specialized services. I don't know.
Well, there's clearly some overlap with specialized services and some overlap here with the economic stuff. And the question is, given our, I love the topics. The question is, given our limited intellectual bandwidth here. What's the right way to parcel this up? And we may not have parsed it quite right, but so maybe we ought to go off and deliberate. But I think the topics are really important. I love the topics. They're both of personal interest to me. So, damn.
I have a similar concern. I think they're both great topics. The concern is we have 4 groups that are still struggling to actually figure out how to make progress on the first 4 questions.
Yes.
And so to the extent that we choose to take these up, if we can do it within the context of the existing groups, because the chairs and the members of those groups feel like, yes, this fits naturally into my charter, and I think we can tackle this when it would make sense. I would hesitate to spawn more groups because I think it would dilute the effort that we've already got on. So maybe they could be phased in as later questions once the existing groups are beginning to wind down or something, if they can't be absorbed within the existing groups.
Yes.
Or you can even start it at the beginning. So, for example, you talk about interconnectivity and what the economic, for every bit delivered, what does the economic pipeline look like? So you could definitely fit that into the economic, if they thought that was, because it's very discrete, it's a very discrete question that if you started with there as a use case, and then from there you kind of go to these higher level questions. Because part of some of the questions on the economics plate are, if they find the answers to those, they may have the answers to life. They're pretty meaty, big, important questions. So, they could also go at the end, or they could also go at the beginning because they're so discrete.
Kevin?
One of the things that's in the order in a number of places, I'm sorry for jumping in, but is that it's clear that the FCC has a goal of encouraging edge innovation and permissionless innovation. They use those terms a number of times throughout the order. And the really interesting thing about the notion of price is that it does allow for a edge innovator to have a predictable environment within which they can innovate, because they know what the impact of the choices that they make are going to be. If you use a network management approach and you begin to discriminate against specific applications, it's very difficult for an edge innovator to make an investment or an investor to make an investment in that. So I think that, I know it's a tough conversation. I understand that if you're operating a network, it's obviously in your interest to be able to exercise more control over the network. But if you're an edge innovator, it's in your interest to have more predictability in the environment that you're operating in. And so I think that price is something that should be a part of the conversation, because I think that's one of the few ways that in the case of peak bandwidth utilization or signaling load, you can send a signal to an edge innovator in a way that disciplines them without discriminating against them.
I want to be sure we leave time for public comment, but Kevin, you wanted to get in.
Yeah, I just want to comment that I think the topics are good. I think they're pretty spelled out in the Open Internet Order, around these 2 areas, and really as Shane talked about economics. As I look through his 4 questions, they line right up with a lot around the questions around interconnects, and I think that the cap element really falls into the specialized service. So I think they're well defined in the Open Internet Order, and they clearly fit in, into topics of the current subcommittees.
Yep, Jennifer.
One quick point. I thought on your first topic about interconnection, I think one thing that fits in the mobile broadband group perhaps is not just how does the traffic get from the content provider to the user, but how could it? And in particular, where are the places in the cellular data network where applications or content could be hosted or cached, or there could be proxies for caching or for signaling or for push services. And that's a very, very active space that's probably going to change a lot over the next few years, and probably something our group should be thinking more about along the lines of the first topic you raised.
So maybe we can ask each of the groups as it meets to be thinking about how and where elements of these questions might fit in, and see what comes out of that process after today and ongoing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I certainly think that at some level, you can reduce a lot of this to economic arguments. The economics certainly have a big role to play in terms of investment and building out different bits and pieces. So that's a natural home for some of this stuff, certainly.
Yes.
It certainly needs to be looked at with a technical element to it as well. I mean, the structure of both of those things, the structure of pricing on interconnect and the structure of pricing on caps, shouldn't be a given. There need to be lots of different ways to look at how it could be structured, how it could be articulated,
yes,
in order to arrive at a solution that I think best advantages innovation at the edge.
Yes. Well, another thing we can do is huddle with Daniel a little bit and see what other areas within FCC might be looking at this in advisory committee and other capacities, so that we're not working in parallel, unbeknownst, with others who are already trying to do
Makes
work.
sense. Good.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. That now gives us an opportunity to shift gears and open to public comment. I'd love to just take the temperature of the room. How many people are wanting to comment in some way? I count about 3 people, and maybe 4. Maybe 5, and this, of course,
Going once.
yes, this doesn't commit you either to speaking or not to speaking if you didn't raise your hand, but it'll help us on time management. So, sir, why don't we start with you? And we have a microphone, I believe, that we can make available to make sure that it goes on the webcast. Otherwise, people on the webcast simply won't hear you. The guidelines are suggestions for what comments substantively as material as possible to the kinds of conversations already taking place, and under the charter of the committee through the order, stuff that would be relevant to things we could investigate, that would be good. And of course, brevity is much appreciated.
Testing.
And of course, we'd appreciate if you want to identify yourself first. It may well be working, it just might not be amplifying. That means it's working on the webcast.
Exactly.
Use the other mic then?
Test 1, 2, 3.
It's both walking and walking.
My name is Henry Hardy. I live in Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm a senior systems administrator at a local university. And I've been a systems administrator since the days of the ARPANET, Nick Handel, HEH. If there is no objection from the committee, I would like to reserve the right to revise or extend my remarks. I did prepare some written testimony, which I shared with you. I do want to preface it with a couple necessarily brief comments about the discussion here today. The primary issue with bandwidth in the United States is that service providers have overpromised and underperformed. In Stockholm, Sweden, 100 megabits per second is $13 a month. 1,000 megabits per second is about $45 a month. That's what you would pay here for 60 megabits per second. If you want to think of it in terms of cars, a Swedish car goes 100 miles an hour. An American car costs the same, goes 6 miles an hour. Citizens should not be blamed for the fact that they're trying to use the services that they were promised and which they are paying for. In fact, which they're paying far too much for. I'm disturbed to hear this distinction between apps and operating system. This is significant in terms of marketing. It has no significance in terms of systems administration. The kernel is, if you want to put it that way, the operating system. Everything else is applications. So the excuse that, oh, this comes bundled with the phone, it's ridiculous. If you want an open internet, citizens need open hardware. This is aligned with the first sale doctrine. It is essential. Mandating interoperability is good, but if you give us unlocked devices, we will make them interoperate. Co-location. I invite you to research the modified final judgment which led to the breakup of AT&T and what happened subsequently. In the early years, co-location was mandated. There was a proliferation of internet service providers. There was true competition. AT&T has essentially been allowed to reassemble itself not quite into a monopoly, but into an oligopoly which is no longer limited by the ideas of common carriage and that this is a public utility. Finally, just to orient the committee, the airwaves belong to the citizens, both statutorily and ethically, not to the government and not to corporations. You are here fundamentally as custodians of the public airwaves. Also, to paraphrase Richard Sexton, having an opinion about how the internet should develop is like having an opinion about how starfish should grow. You can have that opinion. It doesn't really have that much influence on how the starfish conduct themselves. So, if the internet doesn't like what you do, it will be ignored or routed around. To paraphrase Professor Clark, we reject king's precedents in voting. We believe in rough consensus and working code. Finally, security is a red herring. The internet is fundamentally built on trust. A secure internet is not an open internet. Now, I've also given you some written testimony, which I'll try to summarize.
Well, we've got that in the record. I think we want to make sure there's time for everyone else. But
in that case, I will yield the floor. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Hardy. And we do have that written testimony. I understand we are working to get that up actually on the website. And anything else that is sent, we will add to it. And thank you for your comments here, which were indeed complementary to rather than a substitute for that testimony. Great. Are there others? Yes.
My question's for the Mobile Broadband Committee.
And feel free to tell us who you are.
My name is Nathan Ingram, and I'm a reporter for The Verge, a technology news website. And my question is, why was there no discussion amongst the committee about AT&T and FaceTime? We talked for 15 minutes about the app signaling, but there was no conversation whatsoever about FaceTime, and I feel like that's a really important, pressing issue for a lot of consumers right now.
I guess I should take that one. David thought there was discussion about AT&T FaceTime.
It seemed like you summed up what's happened, but it didn't go any further than that.
Yes.
No one said a whole lot about it.
Yes.
In the context of that mobile broadband conversation.
And I could also take that as an invitation to have that discussion now, if we so chose. I can speak only for myself in thinking about how to structure the meeting, and that is the heavy lifting of the discussions goes on in the working groups, and the working groups are designed to be as broadly representative, categorically speaking, as possible, simply because just in the time we have publicly meeting, it's really hard to dig deep. And I actually found myself really impressed at Jennifer's presentation and the way in which it clarified a number of facts that I think one would have to visit several news articles to get, and gave a status of where the working group was at. But I trust that that discussion is not over, and indeed that more may come of it. But if there's anything else anybody wants to say on AT&T and FaceTime, I certainly don't mean to restrict it. Jennifer?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, you're right at one level. The goal of the talk was to summarize what our group came to after about 6 one-hour teleconferences, and that's just a representation of where we've gotten to. As far as any concrete policy recommendation, which I think is what you're hinting at, we're just not there yet, to be honest. And part of it is I think you'd find within our group substantial disagreement, actually, about that. And so our goal was really just to capture the arguments on various sides, and in particular, to put some structure around the issues that would inform an opinion.
For one more follow-up question, just use the mic so everybody can hear you.
I was just going to ask, can you give any like high-level indication of what the conflicts or the disagreements within the group are? That might be interesting to hear, like what the different sides are on this issue.
Sure. I think some of them are summed up in the discussion of what the public press had said versus AT&T's response, and some of it is in those four different issues. Are preloaded apps different? Is symmetric use of bandwidth in an environment where the capacity is not symmetric an issue? How adaptive does an app need to be to congestion? And how reasonable is it for a carrier to do a partial incremental rollout of a new application through choosing users based on a particular pricing plan? And I think you'd find strong differences of opinion on all four of those issues within the group, and I'm sure in a larger setting as well. But those are the kind of questions our group is revolving around. And we sort of played some games with, if any one of those four things weren't an issue, would this have been troubling or not? And again, I think you'd find different viewpoints. But those sort of thought exercises are what we've been doing.
Thank you for your questions.
Yes. Hi, Mark Tomizao. I've been to the FCC hearings and other events here. So thank you for being here. I know that what you're facing is hard because I was an internet kid before the internet. I was a 300 baud kid before you were, and have stayed in there and helped to innovate different things. One of my friends was early at McCaw Cellular, and he later did a deal with Docomo. And then he said, I'm out of here. So he has a nice farm. Here's what strikes me. I also come to the Berkman Center events. There was an Informing Communities event, I think last year, if I've got that right, Jonathan. And it was the Knight Commission, along with Aspen, and it was called Informing Communities, Sustaining Democracy in the Digital Age. And then it said, Information Needs of Communities. So let's imagine that some people, this is a thought experiment, some people got together who were experts at all this stuff and have been part of the system from the beginning, have worked with Comcast and others to grow new technologies, new networks, and basically the things we enjoy. Let's pretend those people are actually willing to work with you. Let's pretend that what you've got is called accidental architecture, which is very difficult. It is democracy. So in an accidental architecture, the key is to look at the complex adaptive systems and go, how do we get equilibrium without bossing anyone around? In other words, where will it settle without money, without power? Just people behaving. What you then lead to is sort of a Prius dashboard where you're tracking certain basic data that you've talked about, where everybody can witness it. And some people will choose to act on it however they want to, and it will lead to further discussions. But you won't have to figure that out. The second thing is, when you look at emergent behaviors, you can see hotspots. It now becomes a thing that venture capitalists love to see. It's a perfect storm of trends. Because this comes down to the behavior of 6 billion, let's say, people worldwide, if they all have cell phones. And that's a really hard thing for any group to figure out. You cannot manage a complex system like that. However, you can monitor it. You can look at it. You can use dynamic systems tools to see behaviors. It's like a weather map. And then you can ask the big questions. But it starts with you inviting people. So I was going to suggest that maybe a working group would be people who have expertise, who would like to help you, because there are huge security risks that haven't been talked about here. And we won't talk about them because we're smart enough not to talk about them on a microphone or on a camera or on TV. Hey, there have to be backroom discussions where really bright people get together and go, what do you got? That would be the Chatham House rules, right? That would also be the Brandeis brief. You can do this, and interestingly enough, we can turn it into something that has some game dynamics so it's really engaging. It doesn't feel like work. And by doing all this, we'll get to the key stuff. It always emerges. And I would hope that Professor Clark would be interested in this, because there's some professors at MIT who have some really good systems X-ray tools. It's kind of like Egerton, but with dynamic systems. We can see things that flow really fast in slow motion. And so we don't have to answer the things. We can start to understand it, but we can involve every person who has a cell phone, every person who has a laptop. We can get old and young people together. And this is all possible. So
I should
I guess the wrap-up would be?
Invoke some congestion feedback, yes.
Yeah, so thank you. I love your presentations. I would say, I would hope that when you go behind your closed doors, you ask yourself if culture is outrunning deliberation. and that maybe that's the tipping point we're in now, okay? I would ask if you need dynamic dashboards to start to see patterns of things, because we know that numbers actually cognitively interfere with people's ability to see systems. And I would say, if you're willing to do one more thing, look at what the definition of a wicked problem is on Wikipedia. It describes this. It's like a big headache that you have to go at through a different way. So it's
there
called
must
a wicked
be an
problem.
exception in Boston for what a wicked problem is, because there's a certain
Wicked
vernacular
good.
there. But
Anyway, Jonathan, thank you so much. These are wonderful. This is all possible. People have been talking about this for 5 years. We hope you'll open a door or two. We promise. We're really good in the sandbox.
Thank you, Mr. Tomazawa. Comments are in the record. Anyone else?
Hey there, Steve Schultz from Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. I guess this is a comment for the Economic Impact Group, something to think about. Depending on the general approach that you decide to take, one thing that I didn't hear as much in your comments was a discussion of higher level economic frameworks or understanding ways of explaining Internet economics. So do we view this as fundamentally an infrastructure model, or do we look at the Internet as a general purpose technology or a common pool resource or a complex adaptive system, right? Now, maybe that's just some erudite academic philosophizing, but I think it might be useful to contextualize some of those conversations, in addition to the very specific, in the spirit of what Jen was doing with her presentation, looking at very specific case studies. I think setting it in some of that context might be useful as well, and there are plenty of people looking at that. So just a thought for one direction for that group.
Yeah, I appreciate the point. I understand.
Thank you. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? And with that, then, let's just do a little bit more business as the committee. We're thinking potentially our next meeting to be in January, and potentially in Silicon Valley if we can find a host who is game. I don't know if there's any comments or thoughts on that, but that's what I'm thinking. Might be a good place to be meeting next. Okay, I see nodding heads for the record. I should be more specific, nodding up and down. I don't know.
Nodding off, I guess.
There's that too. And I should ask you, Daniel, is there anything else we should be doing before we adjourn?
No, I think we've covered it all.
So let me just thank, in particular, the working group chairs for their leadership and their work, both behind the scenes and up during the presentations and such today, and everyone in the committee for coming together and making the time and the bandwidth to be here, and to those who came as members of the public to see what's going on and to add your questions and comments. And was that a potential inhalation from Jessica? I will say that is. Thank you, Jessica, for tuning in. And I now say we stand adjourned.
Thanks, like the voice of God.
Yeah.